everybody, and welcome to another board game review and gameplay demo. Today I've got a game that's actually based off of like a comic book graphic novel thing and is all about electricity. But before I get started, I would like to invite you, if you haven't done so already, to please take a look at all my various social media pages. That's where I'll post new videos as I release them, as well as fun articles and all sorts of other cool stuff. In addition, you can take a look at my Patreon page. If you decide to become a Patreon, then you can see new videos before I actually release them, vote on new videos, and all sorts of other cool stuff. Moving right along, the game that I have for today is Electromagnate. This is a territory control game that plays between 1 to 6 players, split between 2 different factions. It plays in about an hour to an hour and a half, with the end goal being to get the most points. That said, moving right along with things, we're going to get right on into what this game is similar to. As far as similarities are concerned, there are 2 major ones that I wanted to talk about. The first one is, of all things, Risk. Like I said, this is a territory control game, and one of the biggest things you can do in this is that you are able to fight and combat other people so that you can wrench control of different sections away from your opponents so that you can get them for yourself and things like that. There is also a combat system against like AI opponents and things along those lines, in addition to actually fighting your actual opponents, the other faction. The other major similarity I wanted to mention is Kemet. And in Kemet, like in this game, you're able to build up buildings that will make your character stronger. You also have the territory control aspect, and it's very similar in that sense, as well as the battling aspect as well. Not to mention that you really do have a sort of Egyptian-ish theme to this. Again, I'm not familiar with the actual source material for this game, but that's kind of the feeling that I got, because you got like obelisks and pyramids as some of the stuff that you can actually build. So you're looking at that kind of thing, but at a much higher technological aspect. Now, moving right along, I'm going to go ahead and do my demo for how to play Electromagnate. Alright everybody, we're all set up and ready to start playing Electromagnate. In this game we have 2 factions, the red and the black royalty, that are fighting and vying for control of the Earth grid. The way that we fight over this and the way that we control it is through component cards. These will be used to connect nodes to one another, and after all of the individual nodes are connected to one another, the faction that finishes it will claim control of that particular area. The game ends when somebody either controls all of the node areas within a circle, either the inside or the outside, or once the final component card has been dropped and all of the individual node connections have been made. Once that happens, you add up the total number of points on the board, and whoever has the most wins. If it ends by having somebody fill out a 360-degree arc, then that person automatically wins, no matter how many points they have. So the first thing to do for this game to set up is that you will have the teams or the players split into 2 teams. One person rolls the dice, and whichever die has the highest number on it, their team will be playing as that particular factions. In order to do the setup, essentially you will roll the dice and see where your individual characters are going to go. You may notice that on the board we have things like 1-3, 1-4, 1-5, 1-6, 4-4, etc., etc. That indicates the die rolls. So for example, let's go red first. In this case, I rolled a 5-6, which is all the way up here. I would pick one of the characters and place them in that node to start. If you ever roll a 1-1, that means that you get to pick wherever it goes. If you ever roll a 6-6, that means that the opponent gets to pick wherever the character goes. But that's how you do the random placement in this game, right? So we'll just go ahead and place these guys all randomly. And essentially, the faction turn and the player turn is potentially the same thing. If you have a 1 versus 1 situation where it's just one player against one other player, each one controlling a single faction, then that means that each player controls all 3, but you can have 3 versus 3, you can have 2 versus 2, 1 versus 2, 1 versus 3. Really doesn't make any difference. It's just a matter of how many characters they control. After we're done with that, each team, each faction gets a total of 5 component cards, which are the things that we'll be using to cross these lines and connect everything up. After that, we're ready to start. So essentially the way the game works is on a individual player's turn, you can start by moving a character, you can move one node, so you can move from 1 to 1, and then you can also place a component card on any of the connections that node is adjacent to. In addition, if you are already adjacent to another character of the rival faction, you can initiate combat. If there is a component that you don't really want there, you can end up fighting the board essentially in order to get rid of it as well. A note on the component cards for the regular rules, in these areas, the 4 right here, you need to have A, B, C, and D. So A and B are essentially positively charged components, C and D are negatively charged. So you need one of each in order for these 4 surrounds. You also have 2 types of triangles. We've got right triangles that make up areas like this. For those, you need A, B, and C. For these obtuse triangles, these larger ones, these larger isosceles triangles, you need A, B, and D as the 3 components here. If you don't have those, then it doesn't count as controlling the territory for the purpose of getting the points, essentially. So to give you an example, let's say I take this person, I'll move them right there, and then I'll take one of my components and just slap it down right there. Okay, and then the next person in my faction can go. Let's say that they'll move there and they'll place one right there. And again, you just keep going and going until everybody is done, right? Let's say, for example, that I'm able to finish this up and I get all of the components that I need. So I get A, B, C, and D here. Then I would take a red node or a red marker to indicate that red controls that. All that matters is the last component card placed down, right? Now to add up points, the power points you get are the total of the numbers that appear on all of the nodes. For example, here we have 7 plus 6 is 13, plus 8 is 21, plus 3 is 24. I would get 24 points for that. The points you can use to purchase buildings of various sorts. You can also purchase technologies as well. The technologies will allow you to do all sorts of different stuff, including protecting other components from EMP attacks, as well as giving you wings so that you can move 2 spaces instead of only 1 space for a particular character. You also have a teleportation device called the Tesseract, a repair kit in case something gets hit by EMPs, all sorts of different cool stuff. In addition to all of that, the other way that you can get points, or the major way to get points in this, is to create what are called microcircuits. In order to create a microcircuit, then you need to have all of the components needed for 2 adjacent circuits. So for example, if I want this right triangle, then I would need an A, B, and C. So there we have an A, B, and C, and now we'll say that red controls that. Because red now controls 2 adjacent areas, 2 adjacent circuits, that means that we get the total points in all of the connected nodes. So you can expand and get lots and lots of points. And that's good because our buildings cost quite a bit of money, or quite a bit of points. The obelisks are 10, stone circles are 25, and the pyramids are 50. The way that those work is if you purchase one, say I want to purchase an obelisk, you put it on an individual node where one of your characters are, and then it multiplies the points you get from that by a certain amount. Obelisks multiply it by 3, stone circles by 6, and pyramids by 9. So it's a pretty ridiculous amount. Like in this case, it's a 3-3, so that would be a 6. And so instead of only getting 6 points, if a pyramid was on there, then you would get, what, 54 points, because math, right? So that's one of the abilities the buildings can do. In addition, if you have a character on top of a building, you can spend points to upgrade them. The upgrades cost the same amount as the buildings themselves do. And those are things like improving your movement, allowing you to exchange component cards for free, giving you combat bonuses, all sorts of different stuff like that. So there's a lot going on with this. The last thing that I wanted to mention, or the last main thing I wanted to mention, is the combat. The combat system in this game is a little bit interesting. It's very, very different. Essentially, it ends up being a game of Texas Hold'em. If you want to fight a fellow faction member or a member of the opposing faction, each player or each group gets their 2 hole cards, and then we do the same thing as with regular Texas Hold'em, where we get the flop, the turn, and the river. However, during this time, we can spend component cards as essentially wagers, and that's what this little box down here is for. If you wager something, then you're able to change one of the cards that is down here. Oops, didn't mean to do that. One of the cards that is shared. between them. So for example, these guys over here, they already have 2 9s in the hole, and there's a 9 on the board. So what they might want to do is take their A+, because it's a positive charge, which means they can increase the value or the suit of one of the cards by 1. For example, changing that 8 of clubs into a 9 of clubs, and now they have 4 of a kind. You can also change the suits, and the order of the suits is it goes clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades. So if you increase a club, it changes into a heart. If you increase a spade, then it sort of winds back and goes back to a club, etc., etc. If you wager a component that has a negative charge, for example, a C or a D, then that means that you can do the same thing, but you would use a black marker to indicate that it went down. So next we go to the turn. And let's see, not too much here. What this person is going to do, they have a 2 in the hole, so they'll take a negative component and change the 3 down to a 2. So now they've got 3 of a kind. And then we'll go over here to the last one. So there's a 10. And now this person will say, I'm going to take that and I'm going to decrease that 10 to a 9, which essentially means that now they have 5 of a kind, which is the highest poker hand you can get, at least in this game, because it's only possible by using these sort of weird wilds that you can get. So it's kind of interesting, and essentially whoever wins, they get all of the wagers back, so this is a great way to get new component cards. The other thing is that in this deck, in this combat deck, there are random events that occur. There's EMP attacks, meteor strikes, all sorts of different stuff that will immediately stop combat and something else happens. Combat also occurs if you want to get rid of a component card that's already on the board, where essentially you're going to be fighting against the grid itself rather than your opponent. Or there are also random encounters in this deck that attack a specific faction, either the red royalty or the black royalty. The last thing I wanted to mention about this game is the sheer variety of the ways you can play it. There are a lot of official variants for this, including a solo play, where essentially you're playing against the grid itself and in a relatively basic AI, but it's pretty fun, and instead of doing Texas Hold'em, you play blackjack against the house type of thing. You also have the sort of party mode, where everything is the same, so all the component cards are the same, so you don't have to worry about the negatives and positives, A, B, C, D. You've got things where instead of basing it on the total number of points of the controlled territories at the end of the game, you just base it on the sheer number of territories that one faction controls over the other. So in that sense, you have a lot of replayability. There's a lot going on in terms of how you can play it and what you can do and all that kind of stuff. Not to mention all of the various upgrades that the characters can get. But essentially, that is how you play Electromagnate. Now I'm going to go right into my conclusions as well as pros and cons. Moving into the pros and cons for this game, first starting off with the pros, I honestly really enjoyed it. It's pretty fun. The territory control is unique. I like the aspect of sort of keeping track of what component cards have already been placed down, so that creates a lot of strategy and strategic thinking, not to mention table talk amongst your own faction to try to figure out who's going to move where, what they're going to do, and all that kind of stuff. I also really appreciate the ability to change things not on the fly, but change things with regard to having the different optional games, how you play, what things you have, what you don't have, and all of that kind of thing. It really makes the game a lot more replayable and honestly a little bit more fun for my taste. That said, moving on into the cons, there are a few that I did want to mention. First and foremost, something that you guys probably saw are the cards. They're really small, kind of like the original Ticket to Ride before we got the 1910 expansion. It's similar where they're just difficult to handle and it's kind of frustrating and a little bit annoying to do that. Another thing is the rule book. The rule book is not really poorly written and you do get all of the rules out of it, but it's just odd. It's oddly written and it's a little bit frustrating to read it because it's very logical and there's not a whole lot of images and it's sort of spaced out and planned out kind of poorly, and like you think that something is going to be at the front but it ends up being in the back type of thing, you know, stuff along those lines. So it's just a little bit difficult to get through the rulebook itself. Another con for me is, like many games like this that are really heavily thematic, is the theme. Now I talk about this whenever I do a review of a game that is heavily thematic, whereas in this case I am unfamiliar with the characters, I'm unfamiliar with the world, I really don't know anything about it. I did still enjoy the game, I still had fun, but like I always mention when I do reviews like this, is that I just feel like I was missing something. I felt like if I understood the context of the game and that kind of thing, I would have just had that much more fun. You know what I mean? So again, it wasn't bad, but just the fact that I didn't know that and I'm not familiar with what's going on or why it's going on, it just sort of took a little bit away from the game, I believe. Lastly, for the cons is the battle system. Doing the whole Texas Hold'em thing is a little bit odd because you essentially have a game within a game. Not necessarily bad, but the biggest issue that I would tend to have with that is that people don't know how to play Texas Hold'em. They don't know how to play poker. They don't know what hands to look for. They don't know really when it would be appropriate to do the wager so they can change the cards and that kind of stuff. That said, I do love the twist that the creators put on it with being able to change that kind of thing and being able to change the cards and make something different happen with it. But again, if you're not familiar with poker, if you don't like poker, then it kind of falls flat a little bit for me personally. Again, maybe that's something that's related to the theme and they love playing poker in the actual comics and all that kind of stuff. I honestly don't know, but for me it just didn't really work out too well. That said, overall, again, I did really enjoy the game. It is different, it is unique, and I really appreciate that. The rules are a little bit difficult to go through the first time, but once you get through them, once you get used to them, then it actually is quite a bit of fun. There's a lot of replay value here, and you do really have some very interesting strategic options in terms of how you're going to build, where you're going to build, and coordinating with the rest of your faction. So if you do get a chance, I would recommend giving it a try, but if anything that I mentioned sort of turns you off as well, then maybe it's not the game for you, but still worth a look at the very least. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.